It was just before Christmas in 2003 that Hussein Mehdi, with whom we had developed, as me and my church community in Leeds, a growing relationship following on from an event that happened around the time of the invasion of Iraq, invited me to join him on his pilgrimage to Karbala for the 10th of Muharram and for Ashura and for the memorial of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, which he was planning for the following February. It also became a pilgrimage into the story of the sufferings of the Iraqi people under dictatorship, sanctions and war. It was a privilege to embark on this journey, a privilege to be asked, and it was beautiful in so many ways. Beautiful and humbling. Beautiful because of the depths I discovered in the Shia Muslim faith that touched me profoundly. It was humbling in the wonderful hospitality I was shown right across the economic and social spectrum, including from Hussein's now sadly deceased aunt, Farid, whose friendly, warm, open face I will always remember, who along with her son Murthaq, his wife Abir, and their lovely children, Jasmine and Tamara, made us so welcome in their once large home in Baghdad. The home had been divided into two, half having been sold in order to survive the austerity of the effects of Western sanctions in the 1990s. It was in her home that I broke bread and celebrated the Eucharist on Ash Wednesday with the help of her and her family, who went in search of grape juice and helped me burn the palm cross I'd brought with me for the imposition of ashes upon my forehead. And I will also remember the hospitality of Abdullah, who was a distant relative of Hussein's in Karbala, who took us into his sister's tiny home and moved us with his beautiful singing and poetry, while his sister fed us simple, delicious, and carefully presented food. She had been forced to move to this house following the execution of her son, who refused to fight in the Iran-Iraq war. Abdullah showed us the letter his sister had received that demanded payment for the bullet that was used to murder her child. Just one of the many stories I heard about the brutality of the Saddam Hussein's regime. When Hussein and I went to Iraq in 2004, there was much talk in the Western media about the so-called liberation of Iraq. And so as someone who had resisted the invasion, marched and indeed got arrested for non-violent direct action against the war, I went to find out how people felt about this so-called liberation. It is true that one of the things that struck me on entering Iraq was the immense sense of relief amongst those I spoke to, predominantly Shia, that the old regime had gone. But did this, as politicians at the time were claiming, amount to liberation? Saleh, a teacher in Baghdad, told me off, in the way teachers often do, and did, for using the term invasion about the US forces. He said to me, "Mr. Ray, do not call it invasion, it is liberation." Contrastingly, Uranid, whose brother was an Iranian prisoner of war in an Iranian prisoner of war camp for 16 years, said to me, "The Americans talk of liberation, anyone can talk of liberation. Saddam Hussein talked of liberation, liberation for the Palestinians, liberation for his people. But it was empty words. As far as I'm concerned, Saddam and the US are two sides of the same coin." Two very passionate responses to the language of liberation, one claiming it, the other rejecting it. The truth is that politicians, tyrants and military chiefs all talk and use the language of liberation very easily and for their own purposes. But liberation for a people is a deeper process that involves much more than the relief of the removal of tyranny. It is both material and spiritual. It requires not just being rid of a tyrant, but truth-telling. It requires not so much reconstruction and democratization as healing. It requires the building of trust and the possibility of real hope, and it needs to arise from the people themselves. The language of liberation is something that is prevalent in our religious traditions. In the same way that thinkers like Ari Shariati clearly read Islam as a tradition that calls us to liberation from oppression, I read the Christian tradition as one that speaks and offers liberation. In the story of Jesus Christ, in his ministry, death and resurrection, we believe that we are shown a God who is with the poor and marginalized. We are shown a God who in the crucifixion faces the worst of human violence and responds not with wrath and destruction, but with love. In the resurrection, we believe Christ offers us God's love again. We are called to embrace that love and live it in the world. We are called to seek the crucified of today, the victims of injustice and violence, and to respond to the complexities of the violence and pain of our world with love and compassion. To identify with those who are marginalised, and from that place to seek resurrection in real healing, reconstruction and hope. We live that hope now because we are rooted in the future hope of the coming of God's kingdom, of justice and peace. The Parousia, when, as Paul says, God will be all in all. For me, Christianity is a spirituality that struggles with the realities of our world, its hatred, its violence and confusion, and offers a way of redeeming this through meeting God in our active identification with the marginalised and in our refusal to use violence. And it is this struggle with the bitter realities of life that touched me in my contact with the Shia faith in Iraq and in the story of Imam Hussein. Too often you Shia sayings sat with me during my time in Iraq and formed the basis of my meditation and reflection on the story of Imam Hussein in light of the stories that I heard of people's struggle against oppression and war. The first is from Imam Jafar as-Sadiq. Every day is Ashura, every place is Karbala. When Hussein and I set off for Iraq, I felt very unprepared. We had received a good deal of attention from TV, radio and newspapers in Leeds, and we spent much of the last couple of days there going to interviews. I really felt that our time would have been better spent praying, and I felt I could have done with a couple of days of retreat for preparation. When we arrived in Damascus, we headed straight for the border, only to be refused entry into Iraq. So we returned to Damascus and took the opportunity of the delay to go and visit the shrine of Lady Zainab. Zainab was Hussein's sister, who was, you all know this is written for a Christian audience. I was struck immediately by the shrine's beauty and felt a real sense of the presence of God in this place of pilgrimage and prayer. There was a group of pilgrims there singing a beautiful devotional song. The singing was in the spirit of deep lamentation, and I was mesmerized by it. It got louder and more intense, and around me I could feel others being drawn into the orbit of the lamentation. I found myself reflecting on the journey ahead, remembering stories I had heard, reflecting on the disappearance and execution in the 80s of my travelling companions' brothers-in-law, the mass graves, the wars, the victims of sanctions, and I wept. I felt my heart was being broken open by God for the people of Iraq. This was the preparation I needed, and there was no place more appropriate than the shrine of Lady Zainab. And it was here that the words of Jafar as-Sadiq made sense. Iraq today is Karbala, Iraq today is Ashura. And this sense that the struggles and sufferings and sacrifices of the Iraqi people are the reliving of the sufferings of Imam Hussein and his followers became even clearer to me as we eventually journeyed into Iraq and began to meet people and hear their stories. I met Bushra, a woman in her 40s with such a calm and kind face, open and compassionate, who lost 6 of her brothers and her father in the early 1980s and still lives only a few doors away from a house that had been turned into a detention torture centre. She was ostracised by family and friends who were afraid of being associated with her. I watched this woman at the Free Prisoners Association, listening to the stories of others. I saw her in her own home providing comforting words to a young man who was openly grieving over his brothers. I heard her tell the story of her family with dignity and with power. And I was reminded of Lady Zainab herself, a woman who, despite the indignities she faced, spoke out with words of power and truth. I think of the houses I visited, one of them belonging to my travelling companion's wife's family, that were turned into torture chambers. I think of the spiritual deserts that these places have become. Like Karbala, perhaps these places need to become places of pilgrimage. At the time I thought, just as Karbala, once a desert, is now a city that in its holy places speaks of a deep truth, So these houses should become places where the stories of the victims of injustice and oppression are not forgotten but honoured, and where the whole truth is revealed, including the truth of who funded and supported the regime that tortured, massacred and imprisoned its people. I think of the story of Imam Hussein's daughter, Rokia, who when crying for her father after battle was presented with his head on a plate. I think of her death soon after, the effects of such cruelty and abuse, her trauma, and I think of Imam Hussein's baby Abdullah, who died of thirst. And I'm reminded of the children of Iraq today, the street children I saw rummaging in piles of rubbish in central Baghdad, the children with cancer because of the effects of depleted uranium used in a 1991 war. I think of the child psychologist in Nasiriyah who told me that she believes 80% of Iraqi children are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. I think of the record of the execution of a 9-year-old girl found by the Prisoners Association in Baghdad. Every day is Ashura, every place is Karbala. Wherever there is suffering and injustice, there is Karbala, there is Ashura. Whenever we listen to the stories of the oppressed and honour them by letting them drive us to stand against